My stepfather slapped me on my backside. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't something a father should do. I froze. The heat from his hand burned my skin where it had just touched me. He did it quietly as he walked past on the terrace. Mom was nearby, only a few meters away, sipping her cocktail without any hint of suspicion. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. His face was calm, as if nothing had happened, but I caught a faint, dangerous glimmer in his eyes. There was something forbidden in that look, something that should never have been shared between us. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation. "What are you doing?" I wanted to say, but the words got stuck in my throat. He leaned in closer, his smile barely there. "You're not a little girl anymore," he whispered. Then, as if dismissing the moment, he took a sip of whiskey. The taste of the alcohol mixed with the intensity of his gaze, and I felt a rush of heat flood through me. I knew that a line had been crossed, a line that should have remained uncrossed, but it was already behind us. Later that evening, we arrived at a hotel. Mom decided to head to the spa, leaving me alone on the terrace to breathe in the cool, salty air. I stood there, trying to steady my racing mind. I felt exposed and vulnerable, yet I couldn't shake the memory of his touch. The events of the afternoon played over and over in my head, each replay deepening my sense of foreboding and curiosity. Then, out of nowhere, he appeared again. I was alone, and there he was walking past, pausing to glance at me. His eyes met mine briefly before he moved closer, as if drawn by an unseen force. I watched him closely, my pulse quickening. It was impossible to tell if his proximity was mere chance or a deliberate act. The uncertainty was maddening. During dinner, we ended up sitting at the same table. The restaurant was busy and loud, yet every small detail felt amplified. When he reached for his glass, his hand brushed against mine. The contact was so slight that I couldn't tell if it was intentional or accidental. But the memory of that earlier touch made every sensation count. I couldn't shake the feeling that every move he made was charged with hidden meaning. The restaurant, the noise, even the clinking of glasses, all faded into a background that highlighted only the single, unnerving moment. After dinner, I went out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The night was cool, and the sound of distant traffic provided a steady hum that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside me. As I stepped outside, I noticed him immediately. He was already there, in the room next to mine. He stood in the doorway, smoking slowly. I watched as he exhaled long, deliberate clouds of smoke into the night. His eyes, partially hidden in the shadows, locked onto me. I felt exposed, as if his gaze was dissecting every part of me. I lingered on the balcony, trying to piece together my thoughts. Every moment from earlier replayed in my mind. The unexpected touches, the furtive glances, all added to a growing tension that I could neither understand nor ignore. I knew that nothing about this night was ordinary, and I wondered how much further it could escalate. I left the balcony and returned to my room, but the feeling of being watched did not fade. Even in the quiet darkness, I could sense his presence lingering. I sat on the edge of the bed, my thoughts racing, and questioned everything that had happened. Every rational part of me screamed that I should run, that I should put distance between us, yet a part of me was compelled to understand what was happening. The boundaries of right and wrong were blurring in the silence of that room. The night ended with me lying awake, the events of the day playing on a loop in my mind. I knew that this was just the beginning. The forbidden encounter, the subtle signals, it was all building towards something much bigger. I couldn't help but feel that the decisions made today would haunt the days to come. I felt trapped between the impulse to flee and the dangerous curiosity that urged me to stay. I wondered what he would do next and how far he would go. The tension was palpable, and every second promised that things were only going to get more intense. As I lay in the darkness, the sound of my own heartbeat was the only reminder that I was still here, still caught in a situation spiraling out of control. I knew one thing for sure. The events of today had set a course that I couldn't easily change. There was an undeniable allure in the danger, a magnetic pull toward the unknown that left me both terrified and intrigued. And somewhere deep inside, I realized that this was only the first act. The morning of day 2 began in the hotel dining room. I took my seat at the long table, scanning the room for any sign of normalcy. Almost immediately, he appeared and sat next to me without a word. When he reached for the sugar container, his hand brushed against mine, a brief, deliberate touch. I stiffened but said nothing. The contact wasn't accidental, it was calculated. Our breakfast conversation was minimal. I asked about the day's schedule, and he answered in short, clipped sentences. The tension at the table was palpable, not from emotional outbursts but from the silent communication in every gesture. I finished my coffee quickly, eager to leave the charged atmosphere behind. After breakfast, our group gathered for a beach outing. The hotel arranged a shuttle to a nearby beach, and I followed along with everyone else, still mindful of his every move. The ride was quiet, and I kept my eyes fixed on the window. When we arrived, the busy beach offered a momentary distraction. I changed quickly and joined the group near the water's edge. In the ocean, I swam a few laps, determined to clear my head. The water was warm and inviting, but I kept one eye on the shore. As I floated near the middle, a sudden touch on my arm broke the rhythm of my strokes. I kicked hard and turned around sharply. There was no one in sight, and the water rippled with my abrupt movement. I scanned the surface, trying to spot a stray swimmer, but saw only the endless blue. Exiting the water, I reached for the towel that lay on a lounge chair. I had barely stepped onto the sand when I caught sight of him. He stood at a distance, leaning casually against a sun-baked pillar. His eyes were fixed on me, unwavering and calm. I didn't have time to dwell on his stare as I wrapped the towel around myself and walked toward the changing area. After the beach, our group reconvened at the hotel for a light lunch. I sat with a few others, but my focus remained on him. His presence was never overtly intrusive, yet every movement he made seemed loaded with meaning. I noted his every glance, every slight motion that might reveal his intent. Once lunch ended, I excused myself and decided to explore the hotel corridors to escape the group's chatter. The corridors were narrow and quiet, a stark contrast to the noisy beach and dining hall. I walked briskly, my footsteps echoing off the polished floor. I checked my reflection in a mirror at the end of a hallway, composed, alert, but determined to regain control of my day. As I rounded a corner, I noticed movement behind me. I paused and looked back. He was following, his pace steady, his steps quiet. I quickened my stride, hoping to lose him in the maze of corridors. My heart pounded, but I refused to show fear. I rounded another corner and almost collided with him. "Watch it," he said coolly, his tone measured and neutral. There was no threat in his voice, only an acknowledgement of our proximity. I nodded curtly and continued walking. For a moment, I thought about confronting him, but the situation demanded caution. I walked deeper into the corridor, each step measured and deliberate. Behind me, I heard his footsteps match mine until, suddenly, they ceased. I stopped and waited, scanning the dim light for any sign of him. Without warning, he appeared just a step behind me. The corridor was tight, and there was no room for retreat. I felt his presence like a shadow at my side. I stopped. He stopped. We stood in silence, the distance between us shrinking to mere inches. I inhaled sharply, the cool air of the corridor filling my lungs. His eyes met mine briefly, and I could see a flicker that I couldn't quite decipher, a challenge, a question, or perhaps both. Without a word, he stepped aside, silently signaling for me to proceed. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. His silence was unnerving, but I moved past him with as much composure as I could muster. Once I was a few steps ahead, I glanced back. He had resumed following at a respectful distance, as if waiting for the right moment to intervene again. The corridor stretched ahead, and I could feel the weight of his unspoken intentions pressing down on every step I took. I focused solely on my destination, a door leading to the stairs that would take me back to my room. The quiet rhythm of my footsteps was the only sound in the corridor until he again fell into step beside me. This time, he didn't speak. We continued side by side for a short distance. I could feel the tension in the air, a silent contest of wills. I tried to break the monotony by offering a curt nod, but he only met my glance with a subtle shake of his head. His eyes remained fixed on mine as we approached a turn. At the end of the corridor, just before the door to my room, he stopped abruptly. I paused as well, caught between the urge to speak and the need to move on. He extended his hand slightly, a silent gesture that could have meant many things. I stood still, the air thick with anticipation. After a long moment, he withdrew his hand and stepped back. I hesitated at the doorway, turning to face him one last time. His expression was unreadable, his eyes giving nothing away. I stepped through the door, leaving the corridor and his presence behind, for now. I closed the door softly, my mind racing with questions. Today had been a series of calculated moves, each step drawing me deeper into a game with no clear rules. I couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were leading to something far more significant. As I moved toward my room, I knew that each encounter, each silent exchange, was setting the stage for what would come next. He silently let me pass forward. The morning began with an abrupt change in routine. Mom left for shopping, leaving me alone with him in the hotel. I felt the weight of that silence as soon as she was gone, a silence filled only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of luggage wheels. The corridors seemed longer, and every step I took echoed with uncertainty. I made my way toward the pool, determined to clear my head. The pool area was almost deserted at this hour. He was already there, sitting on a lounge chair with a book that remained unopened on his lap. I walked past him, feeling both defiant and exposed. As I passed, I casually dropped my towel near the poolside bench and bent over to retrieve it, deliberately positioning myself so that he could see me from behind. It wasn't an invitation, but a test, a silent challenge to see if he would react. His eyes flickered for a moment as he looked up from his book. I couldn't tell if he was amused or simply calculating his next move. After a few minutes, I left the pool area and headed toward the gym to maintain some control over the escalating tension. The gym was busy, filled with the rhythmic thud of feet on treadmills and the clank of weights. I tied my hair back and started my run on the treadmill, focusing on my pace and the steady beat of my footsteps. The physical exertion helped push aside the constant, nagging thoughts of our previous encounters. About 10 minutes into my run, I caught a glimpse of him through the gym's large mirror. He was standing near a row of weights, casually wiping his neck with a towel. Our eyes met in the reflection. For a brief moment, our silent standoff in the glass was all that existed. I slowed my pace, keeping my breathing even as I studied his face. There was no expression of guilt or satisfaction there, just a neutral calm that made my pulse race. Without a word, he resumed his task and moved away, leaving me to my thoughts and my run. Once my workout ended, I stepped off the treadmill and headed to the locker room. My mind was still buzzing with the unspoken tension from the gym. I quickly changed and resolved to find some semblance of normalcy. The hotel corridors now felt like a battlefield where every turn might reveal another calculated move on his part. I tried to keep my focus, but his presence lingered in my thoughts. As the afternoon turned into early evening, I found myself drifting toward the hotel's bar. I needed a change of scenery, a place where the ambient noise could drown out my racing mind. The bar was modern and sleek, with low lighting and a steady stream of guests unwinding after a long day. I took a seat at the counter, ordering a drink as a way to steady my nerves. I wasn't expecting a conversation, I only wanted to be alone with my thoughts. A few minutes later, he appeared at the bar. This time, he wasn't alone. He moved with a measured, almost rehearsed precision and ordered 2 glasses of whiskey. He then placed 1 glass in front of me, his hand steady as he did so, and offered me a very slight smile. "Cheers," he said, his voice low and even. I raised my glass in response, my mind racing with questions about his motives. Was this gesture simply a continuation of the silent game we'd been playing, or was it something more? I took a slow sip, watching him carefully as he studied the room and then me. The conversation that followed was sparse, a few exchanges of polite acknowledgments and trivial comments about the day's events. But every word, every pause, was loaded with a tension that neither of us could ignore. The bar's ambient music and the low murmur of conversations around us seemed to fade into the background as we sat in our private bubble of uncertainty. As the night deepened, I checked my phone for messages and notifications. It was then that I received an unexpected message. The screen lit up in the dim light of the bar, drawing my attention away from our silent standoff. My heart skipped a beat as I read the text, its contents simple yet provocative. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should share the message with him or keep it to myself. But then I decided to let the mystery remain unsolved for now. I finished my drink slowly, my eyes never leaving his. There was a part of me that craved the clarity of his intentions, yet another part that feared what answers might bring. Every gesture, every look exchanged between us, hinted at a larger game in play, a game with stakes I wasn't fully prepared to understand. I wondered if we were both willingly trapped in this cycle of silent signals and calculated moves, or if one of us was driving it forward. The atmosphere at the bar grew heavier as our conversation dwindled. I knew that this encounter was far from over, that the events of the day had only deepened the mystery of our connection. There was no escaping the reality that every action was a step toward a turning point. And as the final patrons began to leave, I felt the impending sense of resolution, or perhaps another conflict, looming just beyond the horizon. With a final glance at the emptying bar, I left my seat and headed toward the exit, my mind still reeling from the day's relentless tension. I stepped into the cool night air, the city lights a distant glow in the darkness, and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come next. Several days later, the rain fell relentlessly, drenching the city and blurring the lines between right and wrong. I found myself once again huddled under a small awning near the museum entrance, the sound of rain pounding the pavement. I wasn't alone. He appeared beside me almost as if drawn by the storm. His hand slid onto my waist in a discreet, almost mechanical gesture, a touch that said more than words ever could. We exchanged a look, each of us aware that our actions were edging dangerously close to a point of no return. Inside the museum, the atmosphere was muted and tense. The narrow corridor, illuminated by sparse, flickering lights, provided the perfect cover from prying eyes. I moved ahead while he followed silently behind, his breathing uncomfortably close. Every step we took together in that cramped space felt deliberate. I tried to focus on the exhibits lining the walls, but my mind was fixated on the rhythm of our movements and the unspoken signals we exchanged. At one point, as I passed a centuries-old painting, I heard the soft shuffle of his footsteps. He closed the gap between us, positioning himself directly behind me. I sensed his presence before I saw him, a measured exhale, a subtle shift in weight. Without turning around, I felt the faint pressure of his hand against my back as it inched along the curve of my waist. It was a silent command, a promise that our clandestine game was far from over. I quickened my pace, hoping to create distance, but he matched me step for step. His proximity left little room for hesitation. There was no need for heated words or declarations. Our actions had already set the stage for what was coming next. The museum's quiet corridors became a backdrop for our covert interaction, a series of calculated, intimate gestures that carried an undercurrent of tension. After our brief encounter in the museum, we stepped back into the storm. The rain had grown heavier, drenching us as we made our way to the hotel. We sought shelter under a modest awning by the entrance, the noise of falling water covering any hint of what might be said. Under that shared cover, his hand found my waist once more. This time, the touch was more deliberate, more assertive. I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed the moment to unfold, every touch sending a clear message that we were both committed to this dangerous dance. Without a word, he led me down the hotel's dimly lit corridors. The building was quiet, nearly empty, and the silence made every sound, the echo of our footsteps, the soft rustle of fabric, seem magnified. I couldn't help but notice the way his presence dominated the narrow hall, each step measured as if he were rehearsing a part in a play where the stakes were higher than ever. The tension in the air was palpable. Finally, we arrived at a door that stood slightly ajar. The opening looked inviting, as though it were waiting for me to step inside. I hesitated only for a fraction of a second before pushing the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, wet corridors we'd just left behind. He stood at the threshold, his silhouette defined by the soft glow of a single lamp. His eyes locked with mine as he silently beckoned me forward. I stepped inside, and the door closed quietly behind me. In that private space, every movement was charged with intent. He did not speak a single word as he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. The simple contact sent a wave of warmth through me as his hand slid along my wrist. I did not pull away. I allowed the moment to escalate. The actions were quick and precise, a series of touches that communicated more than any dialogue could. He leaned in, his breath warm against my neck, and I felt his hand shift from my wrist to my waist. The pressure was steady and insistent, drawing me further into his orbit. Without a pause, I reached up and removed his robe, the fabric falling away to reveal the vulnerability beneath. In that instant, the room seemed to shrink around us, every detail reduced to a blur of movement and sensation. I dropped to my knees, my actions driven by instinct rather than thought. Every gesture was a calculated move in our unfolding game. The intimacy was not overtly passionate but carried an undercurrent of urgency. There was no time for hesitation, only the immediacy of the situation and the shared understanding that what we were doing was dangerous. The sequence of actions was almost mechanical. His hand guided mine, our bodies moving in unison as if we had rehearsed this moment countless times before. The room filled with the soft sounds of our breathing and the subtle rustle of clothing, a symphony of actions that needed no words to be understood. For a brief time, we were lost in the cadence of our own making, oblivious to the world outside the closed door. Then, without warning, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the room, shattering our rhythm. I jerked upright, heart pounding, as I saw the figure of my mother standing in the doorway. Her presence was abrupt, a stark intrusion that shattered the fragile cocoon of our private world. The look in her eyes was a mix of shock and disapproval, and in that moment, the weight of our actions pressed down like a physical force. He recoiled immediately, stepping back as if struck. I froze, caught between the remnants of our secret and the undeniable reality that had just crashed through the door. The room, which had been our escape from the world, now became a stage for an unavoidable confrontation. My mind raced, not with regret or sorrow yet, but with a disorienting clarity that this encounter had spiraled out of control. There were no words exchanged. The silence was absolute, broken only by the relentless patter of rain outside. My mother's eyes, filled with shock, demanded an explanation that neither of us was prepared to give. In that charged moment, everything that had led us to this point, the secret touches, the covert glances, the calculated intimacy, suddenly seemed like a series of missteps, a dangerous game that had gone too far. I took a step back, trying to regain control, but my body felt paralyzed by the weight of the situation. Every movement was heavy, laden with the unspoken realization that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. My heart pounded in my ears as I struggled to process the cascade of events that had brought us here. There was no time for introspection, only the raw immediacy of a moment that had unceremoniously unraveled our plans. He stood there, his face a mask of conflicted emotion. The tension that had defined our encounter moments before was now replaced by a grim resignation. I could see in his eyes that he, too, recognized the gravity of what had just occurred. Our intimate exchange, so full of promise and peril just moments ago, now lay exposed under the harsh light of reality. In that charged silence, as my mother's presence dominated the doorway, I realized that every touch, every calculated movement, had led to this moment. The allure of the forbidden, the adrenaline of our secret, had all been for nothing. I felt a cold clarity seep into me, a realization that what we had done was a mistake. There was no romantic heroism in our actions, only the stark truth that we had allowed ourselves to be carried away by a dangerous impulse. I slowly pushed myself away from him, every movement deliberate and measured. The room seemed to shrink further as I tried to process the fallout. My mother's eyes never left me, a silent testament to the betrayal and the irreversible breach of trust that now lay between us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I took in the full scope of the consequences. For a long moment, there was nothing but the heavy silence. The storm outside continued unabated, its relentless drumming a reminder of the chaos that now reigned inside. In that stillness, I realized that our secret, once so intoxicating, had revealed itself as nothing more than a reckless mistake. The seductive allure of the moment had vanished, leaving behind only regret and the bitter taste of disillusionment. As I stepped back toward the door, leaving the intimacy of that room behind, I felt an overwhelming urge to walk away from it all, to reclaim a sense of dignity and control that had been lost. Every step I took was a silent vow to never allow myself to be swept up in such dangerous liaisons again. The realization was as clear as the falling rain. No thrill was worth the price of betrayal and hurt. The finality of the moment hit me hard. In the aftermath of our secret encounter, with the echoes of my mother's shocked gasp still reverberating in the corridor, I could only see one truth. All our actions, every whispered touch and clandestine glance, had led to nothing but heartbreak and regret. The thrill, the intensity, it had all been a misguided pursuit of something that wasn't meant to be. Standing in that stark, silent room, I let the reality settle in. I had allowed myself to be drawn into a dangerous web of temptation and secrecy, and now, with everything exposed, the consequences were unavoidable. The rain outside washed over the city, a relentless cascade that seemed to mirror the cold, unyielding truth inside me. I gathered the strength to move, to step away from the wreckage of that ill-fated encounter. With each step toward the door, I felt the burden of my mistake grow heavier. The dangerous allure of forbidden intimacy, once so intoxicating, now lay bare as a series of reckless decisions that could never be undone. And as I crossed the threshold of that room, leaving behind the remnants of a night that promised so much and delivered only regret. I knew without a doubt what had to be accepted. It was all a mistake.